Right, we can begin. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this is a very important occasion this evening to which you're all very welcome. The Engineers Heritage Society, which is a normal night, we are jointly this evening presenting with the Institution of Civil Engineers, Republic of Ireland branch. What we're marking is the bicentenary, of course, of the Institution of Civil Engineers, founded in 1818, and I'm sure during this year we'll hear a lot more about how the institution has developed in that time to be a world leader in civil engineering. It gives me particular pleasure this evening to welcome our guest of honour, sitting in the front row there, the current president of the ICE, Professor Lord Robert Mair. But also I'd like to include a welcome to our own president, Ciarán Fionn, Vice President Peter Quinn, former President Dermot Byrne, and Engineers Ireland Director General Caroline Spillane. If Caroline is here, is she? Yes. Thanks. Okay. Now, as I'm required to do so on these occasions, I should just draw your attention to the exits from the hall in the unlikely event of fire or other emergency. They are the door that you entered in. Also, there is an emergency exit in the right-hand corner of the theatre. Now, our speaker this evening is well known to many of you, and that is Michael Phillips, a chartered engineer, fellow of both the ICE and Engineers Ireland, and of the Irish Academy of Engineering. Now, he had a long career, particularly in local authority work, and he was Dublin City Engineer from 1998 until his retirement in 2015. And Michael served as President of Engineers Ireland during the session 2012-13. Now, he's made an outstanding contribution to civil engineering in Ireland, and I feel is a most appropriate person to address you this evening on the subject of civil engineering in 19th century Ireland. Michael.
Good evening, Mr. President and ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much. I hope I won't, after that introduction, let you down now after this. But when you come to talking about engineering in the 19th century, and as you all know today, engineers, we do not operate in isolation. We're all about teamwork, and that's not even with engineers. It's with all the sponsors and politicians and society that goes on around us. So it does. And in doing the research for this, actually, it brought it home even more so to me, just that you cannot look at engineering in the 19th century without looking at what was going on around you as well. And in some ways, okay, as sometimes we do, because the engineers are sometimes associated with the military, because that's the field we were coming from in becoming civil engineers. We mightn't like some of the things that happened or were done, but that is the way life goes on. So with that, what I just wanted to sort of put a bit of context in it and saying that, like in 1798, coming into 1800, you had a rebellion there with the United Irishmen. Now, the United Irishmen were, everybody has this idea that the rebellions were mainly the Catholics trying to get freedom and get everything, but the United Irishmen were actually the Protestants, Presbyterians, the dissenters, as they were known, non-Anglicans. And they were actually looking for Catholic emancipation for the Catholics, and as well as part of their thing there. You had the American War of Independence going on as well, which was creating major problems, as you can imagine, for the UK, and a touch of Brexit about it maybe. But and then the French Revolution. So you had, and with that, with the Act of Union coming in and the merging of the Parliament in Westminster, which was William Pitt Jr. Really he railroaded it through, and there was a lot of ifs and buts about it. But then you have this man, Thomas Paine, and just to give you an idea, we think we achieve a lot these days. But Thomas Paine was an Englishman he went to the States and he helped in the writing of the Constitution in the States. But then he came back to England, and in coming back to England, he reckoned that members of Parliament in England should be elected on merit and not on aristocracy, which of course was heresy. So William Pitt decided to have him charged with treason, and he then went and joined to France and went into the French Revolution and became a member of the Parliament. And he was heading for being guillotined when there was he slipped through a crack in the sort of floor, and he decided to go back to America, where eventually he died. But even while he was waiting in England, he put together cast iron bridges, and the Tyne and Wear Bridge, I think it was at the time, he reckoned he could do it with a cast iron bridge at the time. So you had these guys evolving all the time, but going on. You had Georgie in Dublin. Between 1700 and 1800 was seen as a great time in Ireland, with the development and with so many things going on. Like it was seen as the second city of the empire, but it was also seen as the 5th largest city in Europe at the time. I don't know where that comes from. I've read it and it's there. And then during that time you had the canal and the Grand Canal and the Royal Canal construction, you know, from Dublin down to the River Shannon. So you had an awful lot of work going on. So it did. And then what you did was around 1800, right, what these good times meant were that there was great prices for wheat. You had Napoleon on the rampage in Europe, so you had. But what that meant for Ireland was that there was great price for wheat and for all the crops coming off the farms. So there was. So the Irish families, where a son had to wait until he was into his 40s or 50s before he could get married, before they could subdivide the land and he could actually make a living for a wife and family, suddenly that age dropped. And that created a problem because the population actually went from, say, 5 million in 1800 to 8 million 40 years later. And in that intervening period, everybody was living on the potato. The potato was the one sustenance crop. So suddenly this is what you get coming into the whole the part of it. Catholic emancipation then came in 1829, and we might think of civil engineering, infrastructure and all that, but what Catholic emancipation meant, all the religions who were not the state religion actually started building churches. So they did around for the next, whatever it was, 60 or 70 years. And so that actually created a building situation there. And then we had the 1838 Poor Law Act and workhouses with emigration to Australia and America. And ladies, you mightn't like to hear about it, but in actual fact, the fare for females to Australia was paid by the state. So it was. If a female wanted to emigrate to Australia, it was paid. The men would have to find their own, or if you wanted to go to America. The problem was, as we're learning more about the situation in Australia, even today, looking back on the history, is you had to go to Liverpool or one of these ports. That's where it went. And in actual fact, an awful lot of the females would have been just rounded up, and they were loaded on the ships and sent off at the time. And that's why we're now hearing the stories back from Australia. And then you had between 1845 and 1852, the population decreased by 50%. That was the Great Famine, so it was. And what happened was that well in excess of 1 million died, and then 2 to 3 times that immigrated and left the country. So it gives you an idea of the context of what engineers had to operate in there, and you'd sort of say it wasn't necessarily a nice place. So it wasn't. The Act of Union, in actual fact, what it did was, it was the merging of 2 parliaments. And you can see today when we talk about Brexit, the first thing everybody says is, has anybody got any facts and figures? Is there any planning done? Is there anything done? And what you had is, you had a situation where the Parliament in Dublin was done away with, and they were given so many seats in Westminster. But now suddenly you had Westminster Parliament giving money and everything to Ireland, and they knew nothing about Ireland. Because these guys, so what they said was, look, we cannot be giving you money and stuff like that. So then they had to look at that. But one other guy that I would just like to mention, because he is very, very important, is a man by the name of William Jessup. Now, William Jessup is one of these guys that nothing is written about. But I suppose it would be a colleague of the president of the ICE this year, Sir Alec Skempton, was co-author of a book on William Jessup. And what he said is This is a man who never wrote a paper in his life, never did anything, but he had such an influence, especially here in Ireland. It's just unreal, so it is. And he said, if you ever want to leave your life story, leave them all gathered in one room in the house when you die, and people will go in and sort it out and write the story afterwards. That's what Skempton did. But Skempton, as some of you may or may not know, was really the father of, along with Karl Terzaghi, of modern day geotechnics. So he is. But Jessup came to Ireland. John Smeaton, who's the father of civil engineering, adopted him after his father's death because he was only about 14 and the father had worked for John Smeaton. But he surveyed and he constructed the Grand Canal from Dublin down to the Shannon. And as you can see there, he building the Grand Canal or building any canal was fine until you came to the Midlands. And there's a slight dilemma with the geography of Ireland. In most countries, the mountain ranges run down the middle and all the rivers flow out into the sea either side. In Ireland, the mountain ranges are around the edge, and in the middle we have a bowl, which is effectively all the big peat bogs. And there was, I'll keep it in acres, there was 3 million acres there at one stage, but at this stage it had gone down to about 1 million acres. And so Jessup built effectively the drainage systems through the Bog of Allen, and he floated the canal system through it, and it took an awful lot of work, but he got it through. But then he built the Grand Canal Basin as well, which I'll show you the acres, and what that then showed as well is the evolution, because when you look at that 25 acres, and his next job, which was only say 4 years later, was the West India docks in London, was 10 times that size, you know, and a capacity for 600 ships. So it gives you an idea the way these guys were thinking. These guys were on horseback. This is the way they were riding, you know, and Jessup was like that. Then he constructed the Grand Canal Junction Canal to London. Now, the Grand Canal Junction Canal, most canals follow the contours around hills between A and B, but the Grand Canal Junction was a very particular one where they had to intercept one canal and take it down to the Thames. So he had no control over the land he was going through, and he ended up with tunnels and viaducts. So he did. And the Blissworth, which you might see on television quite a lot, is one of the tunnels, you know, which created untold havoc. And he actually looked at, it was getting so difficult of actually laying a railway where they would take the thing around it. But the other thing about him was, he was the guy who gave John Rennie his first job as an engineer. And he also was the guy who gave Thomas Telford the first job as an engineer. When you think of the works those two guys have achieved, it says a lot, you know. And that gives you a photograph of him and of the canal system in Ireland, and you can see how the Grand Canal, the way it stretches, and then the Royal Canal, which went up further north, so it did. But what you have here is the Grand Canal Basin and the River Liffey, and then the River Dodder as well coming in, just there. And so the issue that arose there was the Grand Canal actually stopped at the Guinness Basin, so it did, because they didn't know how to actually gain the access into the River Liffey. The ground conditions were so bad and everything like that. So he came along and he built the circular line down along through Rathmines and Harl's Cross and all that. And he had the biggest pumps in Europe at the time designed to actually pump this dry, so it was. And then when he built that, but the problem here was the locks. How do you build the locks in such bad ground conditions? And he used this idea of an inverted arch. And the inverted arch then creates the pressure that will hold both the locks and the changing water pressure, so it did. And that was a great success at the time, so it was. But that gave you an idea of the caliber of this guy. And then he goes back to London and he builds a lock 10 times the size in London, so he does. And you hardly know about the guy. And then when we start looking at the engineering and your planning, here's the foresight. This is what we have today down there with all the regeneration and the amenity that's there. You know, it's just something fantastic, really. And do we fully appreciate it? And at the same time, what we're building today, can you visualize what that'll be doing in 200 years' time? So it will. And that just gives you a look. And what you have here is the Leinster Aqueduct, where the canal actually is in this bridge going over the River Barrow, and where there was a lock system then to get it down into it. But again, to show you as well other stuff that was going on at that time, you had the GPO was built in 1818. The Custom House, the Custom House is a particular issue because James Gandon was brought over by a guy by the name of Beresford, who was the chairman of the Revenues. And Beresford was a member of the Parliament, but he was a close friend of William Pitt. When Pitt wanted a vote, it was like phoning Beresford. Beresford turned up, and that was the only time he ever attended Parliament, it would appear. But by building the Custom House there, they moved the whole centre of the city from Capel Street effectively to the thing, and that was a major thing. He then designed O'Connell Bridge, which you see there in 1794. At the same time, the Four Courts was being built in 1802. And just on the corner there, I just put in, just in case you think there was no traffic at the time, it just gives you an idea what was going on at the same time. So it was. But this gives you an idea here of, here is where the centre of the city was, and the castle is there. And by building the Custom House down there, the old Custom House was here. By building the Custom House down there, suddenly the whole centre of the city moved east. Now, a whole load of Beresford's friends, the Earl of Drogheda and all that, owned the land up here, so that was fine. They were building and making money out of it, so they were doing well. But also he then built the O'Connell Bridge, which stopped the traffic coming up there, and you can see as well in the Grand Canal Basin is finished down at the lower end, so it is. But Beresford, that's him there, so he was a member of the Dublin Corporation as well. But this actually gives you an idea, just to give of the politics at the time. The City Council or the corporation gave a charter for ferries. But the guy who had the ferry decided, why don't I build a bridge? And Beresford was the guy who sponsored him. So he went to Coalbrookdale, and this bridge came out of Coalbrookdale in 1816. So it did. But the catch was that the corporation said you can only charge the same toll on the bridge as the ferry is. So it is. And by the way, if the people of Dublin don't like that bridge, you've got 6 months to take it down and put the ferry back in. So you do. So it gives you an idea of the conditions that to operate. And as you know, in the year 2000, we took it down and refurbished it and rebuilt it. And that was the original colour, so it was. But the tolls only disappeared in 1919. So it did. The official name for the bridge actually is Liffey Bridge, but it has always been called Halfpenny because of the toll. And it was also called other things as well. It was called the Triangle Bridge because that was a form of torture that Beresford used to use. He was a yeoman, he had troops, and whenever he caught anybody, he used to torture them. So there was a whole series of things like that going on. But it gives you an idea. And again, here's a project that where you need the powerful sponsors. But one of the other people, what was happening in the rest of the country? So what actually happened was that, as I said, the members of Westminster wanted information, so they set up a bog commission in 1811. And they went and recruited 10 engineers. And one of the guys for the West Coast that is well remembered is Alexander Nemo. And he was a teacher up in Inverness in a school. And during the summer holidays, he used to work for Telford, because Telford had been given the thing of building approximately 1,000 miles of roads and I don't know what, there's so many hundreds of piers and all that to help with getting the fishing industry and all that going. So he was aware of it. And what Telford liked about him was he always added information in about the living conditions and what everybody was going on in every area. Whenever he did a survey, he just didn't send back the statistics or whatever it would be. He always had this. So when the Bog Commission was there, he recommended to Nemo, why don't you go to the west of Ireland? So he came to the west of Ireland, and he was down in Kerry and Galway. And there are some beautiful maps produced, so he did, of the Kerry, of the bogs down there, so he did. But the guy was also, he was a guy who just never stopped learning, and he kept an open mind and everything. So when it finished in 1814, he went on a tour of France, Germany, and the Netherlands. And Italy, and he spoke the 4 languages fluently, so he did as well. And he brought back that information. Then he set up his own consultancy, and that involved him actually in putting in fountains here in Dublin for the city corporation in the poorer areas. So he was, because the people in the richer areas could afford to get a pipe into their house and do all that, but the poor people couldn't. So he went around and actually started putting in fountains. So he did. And then Dunmore East Harbour, as you know, down the southeast. the British government or the English government was looking at how would they get mail boats across. So they looked at 3 areas, one in the north, Larne, Dublin to Holyhead, which was Howth to Holyhead, and then Dunmore East across to, I think it was Milford Haven. And he designed and built that harbour there. Telford went down and had a look at it and thought it was an absolutely excellent harbour, so it was done at the time. At the same time, if you think 1815 was the building of the Tusker Rock Lighthouse, which is just on the corner there. And he got interested in sailing, and he wrote a book on the navigation of the St. George's Channel down in that area, which you sort of do in your spare time, I'm sure. But he also did this beautiful bridge, which you would see it over the Paolo Fuca down in near Blessing, beyond Blessington, so it is there. And so he did quite a number of things, because in 1822 then was the first serious famine that hit the west coast of Ireland. And he became a district engineer, and the money was given, he got quite a lot of money. The English government just put in money there to do it. The whole crop failed, and there was serious things. So he built 30 harbours in that time. He built the 390 kilometres. But the main thing was he opened up the whole of Connemara, the whole of North Mayo, Neris, and that. So he did. And that was very, very important when the Great Famine came, because suddenly they had the roads to get the food and get everything into the area, so it did. But the problem with it was Nemo's power. He was very highly respected by everybody. He was seen as a very honest broker on commissions and various other things. He had the power to bypass villages. He had the power to pick the locations and build the piers. And to the local people, and particularly the landlords, that was dynamite. Because if he built a pier, it totally could shift, as you know, the importance of an area from one area to another. Similarly with a village, that if you bypass villages, he killed them. And of course we saw that maybe in the 70s as well with some of the bypasses when we were building towns, or going around the towns. And people were afraid the town would die. And in 1831 he was removed, mainly because of the landowners' objections. And Nemo was very strong as well, in the sense that when they were building the roads, the idea was the landlords would provide the labour, and he would pay the landlord for the labour. But the landlord was meant to pay the men, but he didn't. He took it as a lieu of rent. And so he stopped, by the time he got to the end of it, he had stopped a lot of that. And of course that was another reason why they didn't like him. But if you look then at Sarsfield Bridge in Limerick, which you might be aware, he did this before he became the district engineer. But it was designed by Nemo, but it took 11 years to build. But it's based on the bridge in Paris there, the Pont de Neuilly. Now, the importance of that bridge in Paris is Perronnet was the engineer who designed it. And this is one of the first times that a non-circular bridge, arch stone masonry bridges, were being built in Europe. And as a result of that, many other bridges took off, because what you need is, if you're building a bridge like that, you need supports under every band. If you build a semicircular arch, each arch will stand, and if one falls in a flood, the others you hope will stay up. But this was the idea. Now, the Chinese were doing it 1,000 years before that, but that's another story. We just didn't know about it. You know, you didn't have the social media and that. So, but it gives you an idea again of the guy always learning, always prepared to do things. So he actually was taken out in 1831, and sadly he died in Dublin in 1834. Nemo, we think, is buried in Roundstone in Galway, because that was one of the piers he built, and then to help the people he actually built houses for the people as well out of his own pocket. So he did down there, and we think he's buried down there. But it's just one of those very nice stories. Also, he is staying in a place that some of you might know as Ballynahinch House. It's now a hotel down there. And it was the Martin family that was there. And he tutored, while he stayed there, he tutored the daughter, and the daughter went on to become an engineer, actually. So she did afterwards. So she must have been one of the first engineers, female engineers really at the time. So it does. But then in 1831, the Office of Public Works was set up, because they began to realise it was being caught, a lot of the works were being caught between different departments, so it was. And the guy that was put in charge of it was this guy, John Fox Burgoyne, so he was. And he was the chief engineer, but he recognised in going around, he was a military guy, and I would just follow on with a bit of that, but he recognised that poverty was not the people's fault. And he had this idea of philosophy of building the roads again through the uncultivated area. He saw what Nemo had done and he realized this was the way to go. He also realized that navigation on the Shannon was very, very important, and it could be used. So it could. The difficulty with Ireland, actually, as opposed, because some people were basing it on the UK, was that you didn't have coal, you didn't have iron ore, so you didn't have these materials that you could transport and make money effectively. So in a lot of cases you were transporting farm produce, and it had to be in the market in a particular time. And also he wanted that we would construct works which would benefit the community rather than the private individual. And the other thing that he did was, because he had a lot of experience, was he took a special interest in explosives and the safety, because gradually more and more the public buildings were given to them, the harbours were given to the Office of Public Works and all that. But he was also the founder and the first president for 10 years in Ireland of the Institution of Civil Engineers. So, and what they did was they set it up differently to the UK. They set up 3 commissioners who only reported direct to the Lords Commissioners in the Treasury, which gave them a lot of independence. And they merged those 3 offices, so they did have the surveyors. But the other part about it was, which was quite unique to the English institutions, was no English department had a very large direct expenditure of their own and could also lend money to others. So these guys had a lending agency where they could lend money to the railways, to any individual that they had thought had a project that was feasible, to help them get them going. It also helped them to write off some of the loans that Nemo and all these had got for building the roads, and they couldn't pay off. So then in 1845 you had the famine relief works, and then the arterial drainage. But this is the guy, again, he was one of these guys that he joined the Royal Engineers in 1800, and that in a way was against him, because Royal Engineers were not seen as the top-notchers for promotion. So they weren't. They asked too many questions, I think, and that was probably what it was. But if you look at between 1810 and 1814, he was involved in 10 sieges or battles. If you read his life story, you just wonder. Wellington said to him, he was a guy that was running from trench to trench, and he said, I reckoned he was working out in his head which path the bullets were taking. He said he was like that. He was always on the go. And he said many a battle he won because of him. Because he was able to work out exactly how, the weak points and the strong points. In 1845, he resigned from the Office of Public Works because they had promised some legislation to go through to give him more powers, and it wasn't coming. But what he did was he went from there into the Relief Commission for the distribution of food during the height of the famine, and he just organised it exactly on a military thing. But what was very interesting about this guy is the way he could shift from the military to the civilian side. And then he was called back in 1848 to Westminster and the Caledonian Canal. There was problems there. But in 1853, when the Crimean War was, he was the guy who had actually developed a strategy to win the Crimean War. But he was overruled. And after that, he was withdrawn, called back to England as if he was a bold boy, because they found out to their cost if they didn't follow his plan, and they paid for it. So they did. But then he was followed on, and then by this man, William Thomas Mulvaney, who again was very much into land drainage and work on the River Shannon, and he did enormous work during that time. But again, he annoyed the landowners about going through their lands and everything. And one of them, which was the Earl of Ross, which we would recognise as being the place where the telescope is, he actually got a select committee set up by the Lords who overruled and actually made him resign. But Mulvaney was one of those Irish guys who then went to Germany and into the Ruhr Valley, and he realised it was cold there, and he brought Englishmen over with all their equipment from England. The technology was way ahead of the Germans, and he set up 3 coal fields, and it was producing coal like nobody's business. As a result of that, Bismarck and all that took a great interest in him, got the Germans to do the same further down the road, and that's why you have the Ruhr Valley today. And if you go to Frankfurt and you go to a couple of other towns there, they actually have streets called Mulvaney Street. So they do that. But he was one of the cases that we missed, and as you can see, the Shannon is still doing its own thing today. So that gives you an idea that Mother Nature is, when you think you're on top of things, it comes around to you and lets you know. But the other man that actually worked in the Board of Works as well was a man by the name of Robert Manning, and we would know him as the Manning formula for water, flow of water in open channels. And he was another guy that actually joined the office or the Board of Works as an accountant and a clerk. And one of the guys, an engineer there, Roberts, recognised that he had a couple of unique talents, and they were short of labour, particularly during the height of the famine and all that. And he just told him, get out there and start doing a bit of surveying and doing everything. And Manning took to it like a fish to water, and he went on to become chief engineer. And the other thing about these guys is actually they all retired around the 75 or died off at 81 while they were on a site visit, so they did. So you can see how they went on. But he had 200 piers, under his control, and he built another hundreds while he was there. But with the Manning formula as well, he actually took to studying and just working things and seeing all the other formulas, what were the pluses or the minuses, and then he came up with his own formula as the best. And he did about 400 experiments and had an 85% accuracy about how water should flow in it. And as a result, he presented a number of papers, and that it went worldwide after that. So it did. So it gives you an idea of what was going on. But in the background as well, as engineers, we know that there's people behind us as well developing things. And here's another guy, William Rowan Hamilton, that you might be aware that up on the Royal Canal on a bridge, he wrote the formula when he had a eureka moment. And I just put him in here because we rely on guys like this, because we're the applied science in many ways. And from the time he was born, he was really a child prodigy. At 5 or at 6 or 7, he was able to talk Persian and Arabic and things like this. So he was, and he had no interest in maths or anything like that. And he went to Trinity, and he picked up a paper that was written by somebody in maths, and he said, "There's mistakes in this." And the professor, Brindley, or whatever his name was, said, "Would you please write a report on it?" He wrote the report, and after that he was hooked on maths. So and when I was doing a check, I think there's 42 formulas with Hamilton's name in it. Somebody else has taken it and used it, but given him the credit that he has formed the basis of so many other formulas. And what he wrote was the formula for the quaternions. And that's now used, as you know, in quantum mechanics, the relative theory and the field theory, so it is there today. So it gives you an idea of what were these guys doing, so they were at the time, So they were, and so now then just having a look at, because Dublin was so important at the time and what was going on, it gives you an idea, map there gives you an idea of, the south wall was built in the 1750s, so it was. But as you can see, there was silt and sandbanks and everything, and this was always a problem. And when you're under sail, you had this problem. And just in 1842, what actually happened was that the survey was carried out, say around 1800, by Captain Blythe of the Mutiny on the Bounty, and he suggested that a northward wall should be done, not in that location, but that was the one that was decided on when Telford and Rennie were around at the time. So Rennie died in about 1820, and Telford sort of took over, sort of acted as advisor after that. So it did. But what you can see there is that the sand, even there on that one, you can see them building up on either side. And of course, what we ended up with is here we have the Bull Island here, which is, as you know, is so important ecologically. And then we have on the southern one, then we have you can see the sand building up there as well, and the reclamation. But it lowered, got rid of the sandbar and scoured away and dropped the thing on a natural basis. So it did throughout the thing. Sorry. That's just, and this gives you an idea from the sea of when you're looking into it. And again, you can see the way the Bull Island here, and here you can see actually as well what's happening. And if you go down here to the half moon or even there and look out at this area when the tide is out, you do get the feeling that someday, you know what, if there was a bit of a storm, a sandbank would form there and there'd be no tide coming into Sandymount. you know, and now that might create another problem for the people, but it does give you an idea when you're standing there just how Mother Nature is operating, and how do you live and manage and work with it. But one of the things about here that was happening in Dublin as well, because the ships were under sail, and when we were doing a project in 2002 of laying a pipe across here, we were told there's 700 wrecks there. So you can imagine, so we had 5 dredgers, I think, and we had archaeologists on every dredger going, trying to make sure that we didn't do too much damage. But we avoided most of them, so we did. And but what you began to see was the ships here coming in, the ships worldwide, again, because of 17 to 1800, they had gone from 200 to 300 tons to 400 tons, and Dublin was having a problem taking them. There wasn't enough water, depth of water there. So they were under sail, so where would they go? So what they were doing was pulling into harbours like Bullock Harbour and things like that, and lightening the loads. So they were. And then you could come in on a lighter load, which was very inefficient if you think of it. So this is why when this came to place, then that's the way it worked. But one of the problems when you put it into Dublin, then you had a tidal area because of the lack of dredging. So what they did was that they built timber piers out from the stone piers to actually, so the bigger ships could tie up out there, and they might have some water anyway at all times. But again, that delayed times. So Bindon Bloodstoney, there was the engineer in charge at the time was a man by the name of Halpin. And Bindon Bloodstoney came out of college, and he first of all worked in Burr, again with the astronomers. His brother had retired from there, left there, and he went in studying the stars, even though he was a civil engineer. And he actually made observations about the nebulae to do with Andromeda, and that still works today, that nobody else could see. But then he got the job he joined the port. Now he also worked on the viaduct in Drogheda, so he did. But he became chief engineer in 1867, so he did. And he constructed, he came up with this idea, you know what? Why are we building cofferdams and building the jetties, stone jetties in the wet? We don't know what the ground conditions are like. We don't know things and the cost. And what it came out was, you were also dependent on how well the harbour was doing to give him a cash flow. So he reckoned this is a blooming mess. So he came up with this idea, why don't we precast? We can then work out our cash flow. We have all the precast units sitting there, and if we've got the money, we then dredge and put them in. But I've got to design the equipment to dredge, and then I've got to get them in place. But it appealed to everybody to even out the peaks and hollows. So he went on to design that diving bell that you see there, and then he built all the deep water harbour, and they were better than most harbours around Europe, so they were at the time. And this man himself, he had problems with being accepted by the system in the UK, because they wouldn't give him any credit for anything. But even he designed buoys that would stay steadier at sea, because, as you know, they had to be lit and stuff like that. The Russians bought them from him, but nobody in the UK would buy one from him, so they would. So he designed the floating cranes, and then he also, because the River Liffey was tidal up to beyond the railway station, Island Bridge in actual fact, he had a responsibility for any bridges that went over it. So himself and the corporation, actually, I'm sure, were at loggerheads at times, but he would actually do the design. The corporation ended up paying for it. But also what they would be watching is every time you put a fixed link across the River Liffey, it meant it was non-navigable after that. And that was always a thorny issue, so it was. Right up to 1880. So it was. And this gives you an idea. He designed the precast units were 350 tons. They weren't any small things, you know, when you think of it. 350 tons, how would you lift them? And he designed a crane system. This is Smith-Tack's shear legs today, and you sort of say, has anything, you know, it's a replica. And I don't know if you've ever seen these, but you know, you pump the water into the back, it takes the weight, they lift maybe 400 tons. In 1985, the biggest floating crane at the time was about 1,500 tons. You know, when you look at technology and look at everything, now they're up into the 1,000, 10,000 or whatever it is. And that's our idea. But these cranes are very, very versatile. If you're in Rotterdam and you stand on the harbour, you'll see them just zipping up and down. So they do They use them the same as we'd use a mobile crane here. They just pull in, do the lift, turn around, it moves someplace else. So it does. But it gives you an idea of the brains that this guy had. And that just gives you an idea then looking out at the moment. And again, you can see the Bull Island reclamation there, how it has come and how we benefit from it. So it does. So when people talk about engineering and talk about things, you can't do this and you can't do that. Most of these ecological areas, or what we have today, have been as a result, as you know, of engineering things. But when it came at the time as well into Dublin, the problem was Dublin was also seen, when they sent the military over about getting troops and everything into Dublin, they said Dublin is the most dangerous harbour and port in the world because of the sandbars and the winds. If you have southeast winds or northeast winds, you'll get blown all over the place. And just shortly after 1800, there was 2 ships ran aground in Booterstown and Blackrock, and a lot of lives were lost. So they were. So there was a man by the name of Tucher who had been saying an Asylum Harbour should be built. And an Asylum Harbour is a harbour where the boats could go and rest until they could make it into Dublin port. So if there was a storm or whatever it is, but it means you have to have access 24 hours around the clock to tide. And Dunleary was only a small place with a few cottages, and I think there might have been a leprosy colony there. So in 1817 anyway, they started construction on both piers, of the Asylum Harbour. And Rennie was the engineer looking after it, but he died in 1821, and then his son took over, John Rennie Jr. And John Aird was a guy, a very responsible engineer. He worked both with Telford and with Rennie, so he did. But Richard Tucher, when he heard this was going ahead and he knew that there was going to be massive quantities of stone, he went and took out a long-term lease on Dalkey Hill. So he did, and he paid for it. And then he gave the stone to the Dunleary Harbour. He just said, look, I'll sell the lease to you at no profit, because this was so important to him, so it was. And Tucher actually was Swedish. He had been on a ship which had got shipwrecked, and he had stayed in Dublin, so he had. And that. So it gives you an idea. So they returned it by hiring him on the job, and so that was one way of trying to repay him for his out-of-pocket expenses. So so this gives you an idea of just Dalkey. I just decided to show you things, and here you can see actually it's at 2 levels. I don't know how much of you know it. You have one level here, and then you can walk along that level, and then you have the other higher levels there. And the way they worked it, as you know, is they had a railway track up along a place called the Metals, and the full wagons went down the track, and the empty wagons were pulled by the same rope, so you didn't need anything. When the full wagons were going down, they were pulling the empty ones back up. So it was like a loop line going around. And you can see Dunleary Harbour there in the distance, so you can. And then today again we have this amenity here where it's a rock climbing area, and it's usually as you know, if you see a quarry area, it's a big scar on the landscape, and yet that one there has blended in so well, so it has. And this gives you an idea then the lower level of the pier, and then the view from Dalkey Hill. And you would think, in actual fact, here that you're quite close to Dublin Harbour, so why would there have been a problem, And yet so many lives were lost, because even when you're walking down the pier here, there's a plaque on the wall there talking about the lives that were lost, even with the lifeboat that went out on one of them. So it was. So then, just coming around to it then, because we are surrounded by water in this country, one of the most important things during this time were the lighthouses. Trinity House were the main area that had they were the registered charity in England that had the statutory power. But the power for in 1810, the lighthouses was changed from the revenue commissioners down to the ballast board. Now the ballast board was your port. Okay, it was controlled by Dublin Corporation at that time. But that meant, and George Halpin was, while he was the port engineer, he took on this additional responsibility, and he really got involved in it, because over the next 40 years he built 53 new lighthouses, and he modernised or rebuilt 15 others, and then he built the whole administration system for the lighthouses, and most of the construction was by direct labour. So he did, and so he really he's seen as the father really of the lighthouse service in Ireland. So he is, and one of the ones that you would be interested in, because you hear a lot and most people would know about, is the fastener. And the fastener is the first one was in 1849 and to 53, but they were worried that it wouldn't stay up. It was a steel one. I'll show it to you here. There's the original there, that one there, and you can actually see the new one starting here. But they were afraid because a couple in Cornwall had the seas had demolished them. That was steel, and it had been done by a man by the name of Robert Mallet, who had an iron foundry and was very well known for the quality of his work. But he built that one there, and the fastener rock here, it was done. But as you can see, it's dovetailed and all that. Now the reason that happened was a guy by the name of William Douglas was hired by the Commissioner of Irish Lights, and William Douglas was involved in the Eddystone lighthouse off Plymouth or Cornwall, and he was also involved in a couple on the French side of the English Channel, and his father had learnt alongside him the dovetailing and how to put the box together, and as a result he brought that. Himself and his brother were famous lighthouse builders. He brought that knowledge, and he spent the rest of his life working with the Irish Lights. So he did, about cutting the stone and fitting it together in the quarries, and then bringing it to the site and going. Because initially there's something like 6 rows buried in the rock there, and they couldn't get at the 6th row. They couldn't get the 6 rows in at one stage, so he went out and spent his whole 100% of his time there. And the other thing that he had developed with his father was the Portland cement and the strength of it, and recognised that if you get it to set, it is much stronger underwater than any of the other mixtures that they were proposing at the time. But that there gives you an idea of the height of it, and that it is still there today. So it is, and so many of the other lighthouses around the place really. But here now is we then move into what we would call the railway era, which was say around the 1830s or 1840s. And the man here is Sir Benjamin McNeil. And like a lot of things, it's again the connections that are there. McNeil was the first professor of civil engineering in Trinity College, 1840. But before that, he had spent 10 years, 10 years working with Telford, and then Telford died and he took over Telford's work. So he did, building the London to Holyhead roadway. And the London to Holyhead roadway was the first road in England that got 100% funding from the British government, because it was so important to connect again to Ireland. So again, they saw this idea of connection. But McNeil had worked alongside Telford. And again, one of his junior engineers on this job was Bindon Bloodstoney. And Bindon Bloodstoney, he had come up with this idea of lattice girders. Bindon Bloodstoney studied the whole thing theoretically. He did a thesis on it, produced a book on it, load tested the piers, and that's because they were able to reduce the weight of the bridge to take the trains. The whole system worked extremely well, so it did. And McNeil, very sadly, a lot of these guys, when they were building the railways, they got paid by taking shares in the railways. And of course, when the Victorian people suddenly got fed up with railways, there was a crash, and people like him and William Dargan lost an awful lot of money, and he effectively went bankrupt, and nobody would help him. He went to England. He lived with his son and died. He got blind in the last few years and died. And I think it was 2002 was at Engineers Ireland, located the grave in London along with an engineer from Dundalk, and they put a plaque on it commemorating him. So they did. So it gives you an idea. But when you look at the height there, these guys had worked on the Menai Straits. He had worked on the Menai Straits suspension bridge with Telford, so he knew the heights, and that's why it is at that height there as well. There's 14 arches, or 15 arches, 12 on one side, I think 3 on the other. So it is there. But it gives you an idea again of the connections. And Ireland was so fortunate that so many engineers of this calibre came across or worked alongside a guy, Telford. When you read Telford, there's nothing in Ireland that you can turn and say, that's a Telford design. We can say John Rennie was in Dunleary. Telford came in after Rennie, and he picked up on everybody else, but he wasn't really He didn't design anything himself. You know, Hoth Harbour was very much involved. Okay, because that was the mail boat, that was the continuation. It was called actually the London to Dublin road, was it really? And the road, Hoth Harbour, and the road into the centre of Dublin was actually put under the Holyhead Commissioners. They were going to be made responsible for maintaining it. So it was at the time. But the three people that worked under him at the time was Alexander Nemo, Benjamin McNeil and William Dargan. And Dargan came to Dublin. He sent him to Dublin to actually do the road from Hoth into the city centre, which he built. And he was a contractor on that. He was the actual builder on it, you know, so he was. And Telford had done the design. But Telford trusted him. And then, as I say there, he got involved in that. But he died then in 1834, so he did. But Telford's work is just, you know, phenomenal, what he put through. And he just sort of said, he didn't care, actually. I was quite surprised that he did a trip to Dublin, and he said he preferred working where he was. But he said, I like travelling, and that's probably, must be in the blood. But William Dargan, then we come to as the guy that really, he was known as the man with his hand in his pocket. And the reason for that was he just gave so much money and helped the poor. So he did. But again, he learned at the foot of Thomas Telford, and he built the Raheny to Sutton Road. So he did. But he constructed 1,300 kilometres of railway in this country. So he did. And he did the first passenger railway line from Dublin to Dunleary. So he did, out along. Now, at the time when they built Dunleary Harbour, a number of guys, even though Rennie, he wasn't fully on board with it, suggested that there should be a canal from Dunleary into the city centre. So ships could pull into the Asylum Harbour, then go into the canal system and end up. But what the guys, the practical people said, if the winds are wrong or ships have a collision, everything is messed up, because if the winds are wrong, the boats would have to be towed all the way. And then the railway came along and really did away with that, so it did. But then you had the atmospheric railway, which was then from Dunleary out to Dalkey. So it was, and that was, it was probably the biggest one that was built at the time, so it was, and it lasted one of the longest there, 11 years, so it did. It was brought in from England, and that was where you had two schools of thought. It's like the electronics and IT systems today. There was a school of thought that, and Brunel was part of it, was that if you're running a railway, you shouldn't need a big engine block at the front. Why doesn't every unit have something that drives itself? And therefore, you know, that would do it. And that's where the idea of the atmospheric railway. So people were trying all different ideas. Whereas the other school was, which would be the Stephensons and those, was you put an engine at the front and it tows everything, and you make it big enough and strong enough. And you would do the right gradients and have the right. But you see, the thing about having the engine was the weight of it. So it was on it. But Dargan, this gives you an idea there now of the railway line from Blackrock looking in along to town. He didn't actually put it on land. You look at it today and you think it's on land. But what he discovered was he could actually get a license from only one landowner, the government, who owned the foreshore. And he could drive. He didn't have to worry about wayleaves. He didn't have to worry about anything. And there was a couple of guys here, Clonbury, Lord Clonbury and all that. And as you notice when you're going through there, there's a bridge out because he needed access to his baths on the seaward side and things like that. But we have reclaimed everything in between with the public park and with everything like that. And as you know, the nature park there in Booterstown is part of that today, so it is. And it gives you this idea. But it was actually built out on the sea, so it was, because that was the cheapest and quickest way of doing it, so it was. And that. But then what you had was in 1844, the Dublin to Drogheda railway line was opened, but the viaduct wasn't finished. The viaduct wasn't completed really at the time. So when it came to 1853 and the Great Irish Exhibition, he actually, in order to get people in, they made the scaffolding strong enough that it could take the trains, and they ran the tracks on the scaffolding. So they did, to get the people down to the Great Exhibition, so it did in 1853. And he, at the time, as you know, he lived in Mount Anvil in Dundrum, where the school is today, and the bridge in Dundrum, as you know, is called after him. But he, the Dargan actually was building this bridge at the time, so he was. But Dargan as well, with the 1853 exhibition, he built the whole thing. It was 100 metres long, the front of it was. But he built it all using railway tracks, and everything could be recycled. Because you will read some American documents which says there's no trace of the Great Exhibition in Dublin of 1853, and that's because Dargan designed it. It went up in a number of months, and he designed it. It could be taken down, and it could be all reused. And that was the genius of the guy. He put in £100,000 at the time, and lost 20,000. He made a deal. He also connected it with a guy in Chester who ran tours of English people over. And there was thousands of people came at the time. I don't know whether it was 1 million went through it in the period it was there. But the Queen came over and visited him actually in Mount Anvil and offered him a knighthood. He politely turned it down. So he did, because he said it was more important that the people of Ireland should have something out of it rather than his knighthood. That rebounded on him later. He died when he died at the time, but he died penniless, effectively. And the state would not give his wife a pension. And it took him 10 years for the civil service to agree. And everybody said it was because he had insulted the Queen at the time, and that. So it just, the system was there, so it was. But this was the graving docks then in Dublin docks that, again, Dargan had built. And a lot with Dargan was, even the Mullingar to Galway line there. Again, that was another one across the bogs where he floated the railway across. But that was in the height of the famine. And they put a penalty on him. Would he do it? Like, they weren't going to tender. They just said, look, Dargan is a fair man. He'll do it right. He employed 50,000 people and completed it 3 months ahead of schedule so that they would have food to eat. So it was. And the English government said they would give him money. So they would. But he, on one of the places when they were turning the sod, there was a farmer there. And he turned around and he gave him a fiver. And he said, you go away and celebrate what we're doing here today with your neighbours. And the person said, why are you giving him money? And he said, because that will give me that will bring far more honey to me, he says, than I think the phrase was something to do with a bottle of vinegar. But his whole idea was that he helped people out everywhere he went. And when he gave up the idea, this is, sorry, I'll just say first, these are the main lines that he would have done all the way down along, and he did the one from Limerick down to Waterford and that as well. So it gives you an idea like how stretched he was really, and the amount of work that he had going on at the time. But just to give you an idea, sorry, when he was finishing up, he had a fall from a horse. He then, because he opened the railway to Bray, he went to Bray and he got the guys, he took shares in a hotel and he got them to open up the hotel, and then he got them to build Queensborough Road and build the houses, because his whole idea was this could be a great summer resort area for people. He knew people did go there, but not in the numbers. He now knew with the railway we can get the numbers. And in actual fact, he had a factory in Dublin, and he took 700 of the employees down there for a day. He brought them to the train and brought them down and gave them a day out. And some of them had never seen Bray or anything like that before. So he was really a part of the people, so he was. And as you know, there is a statue to him outside the National Art Gallery, and he refused to turn up for that. He says not many people have a statue put up while they're still alive of them. So he says, I'm afraid my demise might be in the near future, and I shouldn't attend, So he was that type of man, but he as I say, he gave away everything he had. But just to give you an idea of the engineering that was involved as well at the time, and this was now coming up near 9. I don't know if many of you would know this area. This is where the River Barrow, which is the second largest river in Ireland, joins the Suir. So the River Nore has come in further up here. And down here is an area known, this would be Great Island, so to it. And there's a bridge there that goes across which connects Waterford with Rosslare, that we would have heard in recent years they want to close it down and they want to do this, Daniel. But the bridge on that, just to give you an idea, it's at 2,000 feet. And it was the longest bridge prior to building the steel bridge in Derry in 1984. But the opening of that span is just here, as you can see, on the Kilkenny side, and there's nothing over there, really, because of the currents and everything on that. And coincidentally, it happened that a ship hit the side spans of that and sheared the legs. The legs now are the same size as what you see on the loop line down there. They're about 4 metre diameter, and it broke both legs. And the bridge was about to collapse, but the guy on the opening span saw what was happening and he jammed it shut. So he did. But I happened to be involved in carrying out the repairs, because they only had 6 weeks for the repairs because the beat season was coming in and they needed to get the beat across here on these tracks. But the men in those casings went down 40 metres under compressed air, and that's what they were working on. It was William Arnold of Scotland was building the bridge, so it was at the time. And when you think of the isolation of the area, and they had 5-ton steam derrick cranes and putting up that bridge, and that bridge is still operational. But it was just, it's quite phenomenal to see and each of those are riveted together, so they are. One of the downsides is I'm standing on the bridge one day, and if you stand on a railway bridge, you know there's no timber under you. You know, you're looking at the water underneath. And I was walking out along to where we were working, and I meet a man with a bicycle coming against me, you know. So I said to him, I said, I just go back. I said, where are you coming from? And he said, oh, I know, I was in for having a few pints in Waterford, which is just down here, you know. And he said, I'd have to go all the way up to New Ross and all the way around. So he says, what we do is we get off the bicycle and we walk across the bridge when we're going home. And I said, would you do that? Well, it's mostly late at night when we'll be doing it, but you know, so it didn't bear thinking about us following on the next question, you know. So it didn't. But it gives you an idea of what's there. And this is William. It was just lovely to see this bridge, as you know, the Lewis Line Bridge in Dundrum, called after William Dargan, right in his own back garden, and that the man is getting recognition at long last. So he is. So the next part then that you come to is then the next biggest thing that really happened was, of course, was the supply of water, drinking water, and the drainage. And you had a cholera epidemic about 1832, and another one in 1849. So you had, and here were the three people, and talk about stalwarts they were, you know, really. You had Park Neville was the city engineer, and he was the first city engineer that was paid, actually. So he was normally a city engineer up to then, from 1670, I think it was, or just before the Battle of the Boyne. He was paid, but he was promoting. Sorry, before that, what you did was, when they wanted a job done, you priced it and you took your salary out of the commission, out of the job that you were getting. So you got 10% for designing it or whatever it was and supervising the construction. But then you have Dr. Cameron. He was an outspoken doctor at the time, but way ahead of his time. He wrote something like 400 papers on medicine. At the time, he was head of writing articles, and he with the country as well, diagnosing diseases and telling what should be done, and what was, particularly with the poor people of the thing. And then you have this man, John Gray. He actually studied to be a doctor, so he did, and a physician. He then was proprietor of the journal that a lot of you would know, the Freeman's Journal, which was the main paper of the day. He owned it, so he did. He was also a member of Dublin Corporation, and he was also a member of Westminster as an MP for Kilkenny. Now don't ask me how he figured all that out, but he was able to do all that, so he was. And he just never stopped. He was chairman of the Waterworks Committee, and he said he was going to get it right, so he was. Now the big problem in Dublin was, sorry, that's just a map, is that the water up to this period in time was supplied 80% by the canal companies and 20% by the River Poddle, Dodder and other sources. So and the problem with the canal company was they kept squeezing water all the time. In fact, with the Royal Canal, they weren't too bad. They stopped the boats going on the canal to make sure the city was getting water because they were making more money. But with the Grand Canal, it was different. They would promise oceans of water, and then now the corporation were no saints either, because they weren't paying them half the time, I think. And in 1800, as far as I know, they just shut off the supply 80% to the city for a week. So it wouldn't have done you any good to be around that time. But so then when they brought legislation into, they looked at a scheme down in Newbridge to bring water to Dublin and elsewhere in Kildare. Every time it went to Westminster, because that's where it had to go, the canal companies had an awful lot of power, both with their colleagues in the UK from the canal companies there, that they always got beaten, so they did. But John Gray said it was over his dead body, he was going to stop. So they eventually decided to bring in a consultant called Hawkshaw, who identified actually the three sources that exist today, which was the roundwood system down here, the Vartry, the Bornabrina, and then the Ballymore Eustace system in Paulafuca. They started one he've identified further up, but they recognised those, but and they put forward that, and the canal companies then came forward, and there was a royal commission, and a man by the name of Huxley, very similar to the consultant, came in, and Huxley was a guy who had been out to India, he had been to South America, he had just been all around, but he was again a very trusted guy, and he said the Vartry system is the most expensive, but it's the one you have to go for. And he said you can make money by selling water to the towns along the way. So he did, and the corporation accepted that, so they did, and they went to tender, and that's the system that was built in 1860 and commissioned. And part of it, and then the pipes were laid into reservoirs in Stillorgan, which is someplace there. And as you know, it just shows how future generations then came along in that. The problem with the Dodder was there was too many mills on it, so the compensation water that would have to be let go would be too much. But with actually the Vartry system, there was 5 mills on it. And when it came to Westminster, the commission, the Westminster people, it took 5 weeks to get it through the House of Commons, and it took 5 days to get it through the House of Lords. And what they said was, the mills, compensate them, but they get no water. So you have 100% of the Vartry to store for water for Dublin. And it was seen as an extremely clean supply, so it was. And because they've had problems in Manchester and various other places like that. So this gives you an idea of you know, you can see the two. What happened was, this was the first reservoir with the treatment works here, so it was. And then there was a drought in 1890, so they went ahead. They had planned for a second reservoir dam, so they built the second dam there. So they did, and we have the benefit of that today. But this gives you an idea. You can still see the old sand filtration bed still there today. And what you have here is, you had a beautiful aesthetic fountain on the way in, but they also put in a generating station here to generate electricity, so that the water coming down off the dam would generate electricity to operate any plant that was in the place. So it was. The building, the modern building that you see here, was there because this water was soft, and it was quite very, very interesting actually, because there was a school of thought. The water from the canals was hard, that something between 26 and 35 people per 1,000 died if they were drinking soft water, and only 25 to 26 died if they were drinking hard water. So again, this was an argument put forward by the canal companies at the time, and but in the 90s, a lime dosing plant was put in there, and it was there. Now, what actually happened is, as well, when the water comes out of these reservoirs, it goes into a tunnel which is about 4 kilometres long, known as the Callow Hill Tunnel. And after that, it's gravity all the way. And 80% of the water to Dublin is supplied by gravity, no matter which treatment works, except for the leak slip and up into the north side of the city. So it is. So this gives you an idea of what happens when you get a drought. There's 1976 on the top, and this is 1990, and it gives you an idea of when it's full and when it's empty. So it is. And you know, so and you can see there's actually a channel dug to get the water into the draw-off tower there, into the lowest point in the draw-off tower. So it gives you that. Now, when the tunnel was being constructed, actually, again, it's just it's a rectangular tunnel, so it is, and it's unlined, and there has been quite a number of rockfalls in it. But they tried out various things. But one of the men that came there was a man by the name of Captain Beaumont. And this was his tunnelling machine that he tried, and he spent about 3 months there, and he then took it out. But 2 years later, that was the man that actually started the first tunnel off the cliffs of Dover, heading to France. And when he was, I think, something like 300 metres or 400 metres out, the British government stopped him because they were afraid of the French invading England. So they were. But again, it just shows again the connections there and the evolution of how engineering designs evolved. The rock here was extremely hard, so it was, but it's still working today. The problem is it needs to be replaced. What you then see here is the reservoirs in Stillorgan, which were, these are treated water reservoirs now as opposed to untreated. And that is a difficulty in today's environment because they should be covered. But back then, the first two were done, and these were known as the Prince of Wales reservoir. And then following the drought, and in 1925, this one, the Grey, after John Grey, was constructed, and you can see those there today, so you are. And what you have here then is you have a beautiful screen house where the water is drawn off and it's fed into the system. But also what you see here, just going along here actually, is the Bray railway line that Dargan built at the time. And what they did was they laid the big arteria, the 33-inch and the 24-inch coming in from Rowan, they laid it under the tracks so that they didn't have to worry about wheel leaves to get access into the thing. And today the Lewis is running on it. So it is. But when it comes to sewage then, that, this is the sort of issue that you had, and you had it mainly in up in the Liberties and everything like that, where everything was dumped out windows and gardens. When you read the records, you know, there was 6 feet of sewage in the gardens and things like this, so you could imagine how typhoid and cholera and all those type of things were there. So what you ended up with initially was you had open trenches where everything was thrown in, and then they were being blocked up. So people then started, the city, when it instituted about 1800 a paving sanitation department, they started covering some of the they were actually originally rivers or ditches. They were covered in, and then they became what we call combined sewers. So they did, and then of course what they did was they flowed right down into the nearest area. But again, it shows society and what you come across. When they started doing this in London with Sir John Balfour at the time, and putting in the proper sewer system, it meant they were removing the cesspits from the basements of the houses, not even from the bottom of the gardens, from the basements. The guys were taken to court because they were taking away a civil right for people that they said they wanted to have their own cesspit in their own house, you know, and that now the courts threw it out, music, but it just shows what way people think about what your civil rights are. So they are, but again, so this. And that, but then what you have is Park Neville. Then he was an extremely, actually his father was from 1800 to about 1888, I think it is. They were all Park Nevilles, you know. His father was there and his uncle was there, and then Park Neville himself. So you could see, you know, again that they kept it in the family, and that have effort. So they did. But he took control of it. There was about 57 kilometres of sewers, but by 1879. He improved 8 kilometres, which meant he rebuilt them effectively and built another 104 kilometres. And that. So this gives you an idea then that when they started looking at how they were going to get rid of the smells and tidy it all up, the idea was build 2 interceptor sewers down along the quays, and then this part here is actually in tunnel, which was done in tunnel at the time, but then take that to the new sewage treatment works that would be built. Was built. This all started about 1894, so it did with the construction. So it intercepted all the sewers going down. But today you still have a series of overflows. I think we may have 20 or 30 overflows still there that go in now. They don't operate except in times of extreme rain and that. But again, in accordance with the EU directives, they will have to be taken out. And something like what's been done in London at the moment, maybe, which is a deep tunnel. Sewer put in that it's all directed into, but it gives you an idea, and it also, the picture up here then gives you an idea that you have this idea that the quays are straight, you know, down along, but they're anything but so they are. So this gives you an idea of where the old treatment works were then. The pipes came right down along, I think you can see there, and into the treatment works. There was this small little area here, and this was all the sea back then, so it was. This has all been reclaimed, and that. So it gives you an idea. And this was the Admiralty and the fort. And what you have here is, this was a little dock. Sorry, yeah. You have a little dock there, and that dock actually was built back in 1800, so it was, because again the ships couldn't get out of the sailing boats. So what they did, if there was passengers, they pulled in there, and you could get off. And there was a hotel built there, and the man who ran it was Pigeon, and it's known as the House Hotel. Even today, it's conserved. There's conservation orders on it. But that's where it was. Now the problem was that when in coming up this road here, you had to be careful of the highwayman, and that was just one of those risks that you took. So it was, and so this gives you an idea of the construction of it there. You can see it and the finished works at the time. So when I was looking at the thing then, this is a bridge that we built, as you know, in I think we opened it in 2006, and you begin to think, what will that be in 200 years time? You know, where will it be? So I came across something that I think you may find just interesting, and it's only 2 minutes, and this will finish it. About, say, engineering infrastructure and alternative uses, for want of a word. The lady's on the bridge just above it, the Sean O'Casey pedestrian bridge. She is. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that fascinating review of our history. You know, each aspect of it would be nearly a lecture in itself, but I think you did very well to keep within the time. Okay. But I'm sure there'll be other plaudits later. Could I, at this stage, ask Don McAtee to take the chair? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ron. Well, I can honestly say, as this has been a fascinating evening. And I knew it would be. And about 6 months ago, when we were deciding what we were going to do to celebrate ICE 200th anniversary, I was over at in a conference in Europe, and the thought came to me is that we would have a 3-day event with our president, and that we would do something that people would remember it. And I think that what we've had today is I got in touch with Michael, and without much hesitation he agreed to present this lecture today. Now, there's a little bit of a trade-off, but I'll come back to that one anyway. So Michael is, as I mentioned, is a past president of the Engineers Ireland, and he's also a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers. And as you can see there, he mentioned the Calatrava Bridge, and there's these two iconic bridges that we have now in Dublin here, the Samuel Beckett and the James Joyce. They were both championed by Michael when he was city engineer here. And as some of you that know Michael and have ever sat down with him, the one item that keeps coming back is bridges. And it's the one love of his life. And he tells us of the time down in Waterford when he was building the bridges before he joined the local authority. And before he retired, Michael decided that he was going to put his little stamp on history. Not so much that he himself was going to write it, but he commissioned 5 books. And the first of them was the Bridges of Dublin, which was published in 2015. And he got Annette Black and Michael Barry to produce the book. And it's a very, very fine book. If you're ever way interested in the history of the Bridges of Dublin, this is the book to get. And if you're too lazy, you can actually go onto the internet and find it there as well. There's a story of all the various bridges, very well done. The next one then was one which I was involved in with Michael Cochrane, the rivers Dodder and Poddle. And we did a history of the mills, the droughts, the public water supply from Bornabrina. And the third one then was the Irish stone bridges. This was a history which had been done by Peter O'Keefe and Tom Symington, I think in about the 1880s or 1980s. And Michael decided that the book, of course, is out of print, so he commissioned Ron Goodbody to revise the book, and under the auspices of Dublin City Council, it was published. The fourth book then was the I'm losing it here. The Rivers of Dublin. Yes, this was one which Claire Sweeney had produced, showing most of the rivers which are underground rivers. And Jerry O'Connell and Michael Curtis, they took it on board and revised it and got new photographs and that has just been published. Yeah. And the fifth one, and again this is where Michael and his history comes in. Michael realised that while he was in Dublin City Council, that over the last sort of 25 years from about 1990, there's been tremendous work done in the City Council. So Michael then got in touch with Michael Cochrane. Now Michael Cochrane is, I think, 87 at the moment, and he produced anyway the first of a history of engineering in Dublin City Council, and he passed it over to me a couple of years ago to look at, and all the information that Michael got was by going into Dublin City Council and asking people what was done. And when I saw it there, I realised that about 2/3 of the big projects that had been done over the last 25 years, they didn't exist in his dissertation. And the reason for that is that all that information has been lost. There's nobody in the corporation now or the City Council that actually remembers these. And that's a very short time. So I then got on the phone and ringing up various people, and we've got up to about 80 pages, or no, about 60 or 70 pages now, and that will be hopefully published within a few months. So I've put a little bit of effort into that. But those 5 books that 5 histories that I'm talking about, it was due to the City Council coming on board and sponsoring that. And like some things were quite expensive to produce, but the City Council realised that here's something that we can leave after us, and Michael was the champion of it. And I was thinking when I was sitting down there tonight, maybe there's a 6th book here that Michael might write. Anyway, that's
as an engineer, I can't write a book.
So with that, now I'm going to open to the floor here for anyone that would like to give us a little comment, dissertation or whatever. But before you ask any question, could you please use the mic, because this is being webcast, and also it will be available in a few weeks' time on Engineers Ireland TV, so that if you ever want to get some of your friends to look at it, to realise what big engineering projects were done in the 19th century here, it'll be up there for anyone that wants to watch it. So could we have anybody with comments or questions? Well, don't all be shy now.
For the younger generation, I would say, you know, when you're looking at the time that's there, and we look at what's happening in the UK, and we look at what's happening in Europe and in America, you're going through a very similar time, you know, and it's how do you match it, and how do you actually manage it, and as engineers, how do you actually work with it, you know? Sorry.
Cormac Bradley from IC Republic of Ireland branch. Michael, you said that the engineer who's a member of the Royal Engineers, that one of the things that he was doing during famine times is that he was responsible for effectively feeding the masses. I suppose most of us of a certain age would remember that in history, the British treatment of the Irish during the famine times wasn't perceived to be particularly generous, but what you appear to be saying there is that there were notable exceptions to that. Can you elaborate a little bit on what he did that was different, and why he's seen so much more favourably than some of the others maybe?
No, I wouldn't be an expert on the famine, and it's to my detriment really, because I had hoped, in fact, in doing a lot of this research, I've identified certain areas I need to actually just even take up reading. But what I did learn was that the one thing that really annoyed both Nemo and Burgoyne was the landlords. There were absenteeism landlords, and even the British MPs in Westminster were trying to find ways to force the Irish landlords to come back and manage their lands. So they were. Because Nemo said if you went into alternative farming, he had seen what was in Scotland, and he said it didn't work in Scotland, that there was a way that when you put in the land drainage and you developed the land, that you actually could employ more people and give them a decent acreage on which to grow, you know. So you had these you had a very small number of people who went out of their way, but the opposition that they were finding at a lot of areas, because of the power structure and the political structure of the landlord. Like, one of the advantages, say, for the engineer was, as I said, that all he had now was the Lord Lieutenant and a senior civil servant in Dublin. So he didn't have to worry about the politicians in Dublin. You know, it meant that once a decision, if he got approval, you could go with it. And the assistant secretary or whoever it was that was there actually gave these guys, but it was only a small number of people, and they were fighting. It was like an uphill battle all the time. The landlords were not interested in helping the people as such. They didn't care. They put them out on the road, as you know. In England, then you had William Pitt, who had a very, for want of a word, I think he was a bit like maybe Theresa May at the moment. He was caught with votes, and therefore he needed to make sure that he could get things through. And a number of times he lost out, and he had to go for re-election and things like that. But that was the problem, and they didn't provide until it was too late.
Thanks very much.
Could
Kevin
you identify yourself first?
I'm just about to, Don. You just stopped me in my gallop there. Kevin Sheridan, past chairman, Institution of Civil Engineers, Republic of Ireland. I'd like to congratulate you, Michael, for an excellent talk, and it was, as already been stated, a fascinating talk. And I think one thing Don left out is you're our first recipient of the Outstanding Achievement Award for the Institution of Civil Engineers, and I have to say I was very proud to be there presenting you with that award, and congratulations again. Fascinating talk.
Cogordichus Vincant and similar father. That was very most interesting paper we've had from Michael.
Could you introduce yourself? Could you introduce yourself on the microphone?
Angus O'Hoka,
Please, thank
consulting engineer some time ago. I think the information he's given us tonight was information that most of us didn't know much about. So I think I will welcome when it's published and we can read it. Which brings me back to an issue which I think the Heritage Committee of the Academy are dealing with at the moment, and that is records of works carried out. And in the digital age we have a real problem because people give talks and we don't have a record of quite a few of them. So that's a problem, I think, for the institution to deal with probably in the short term. I was glad Don spoke tonight because I'll be looking forward to him writing a book perhaps on Nigeria, where he worked with our firm for a number of years and picked up a lot of, I'd say, very interesting work and customs and what have you. And thank you again, Michael.
If I may just make a comment on it. I read a book recently, a book called Heavy Reckoning, and it's about the medical situation in Afghanistan in relation to the army. And you said, why would you read that? But what's just interesting about it is the book is written by a girl, Emily, I don't know what her second name is, but she's actually an official historian, even though she's a doctor. And she's employed by a foundation in England to go into areas where they are doing what you would call unexpected things or new projects or whatever it is. And her whole idea, she sits and writes the story and then disseminates it out. And if you read this book, you can read each chapter as it is, but it's the story of the unexpected survivors. The soldiers who walk on the IEDs and they lose their legs, and they lose their hands. And how the whole medical situation, now you can read any chapter, I would start of, what I said to my wife is, start at chapter 6, because then they're talking about the rehabilitation, because the first few chapters can be a bit hard going when you're talking about it in Afghanistan. But each chapter has it, but it tells the story very, very well that we engineers can learn so much from. How do you disseminate the information and how do you record it for posterity? Because one of the issues that came out of that book was that they had lost so much information. The only place in recent times similar to Afghanistan was World War I. Actually, the bombs that went off and the damage they caused, not just to the limbs, but to the internal organs and everything like that. The guys in World War I, when she examined the information from all the doctors, and that all information was brought back, was exactly what was happening in Afghanistan. But when they came back and they wanted to set up medical units that would deal with this in the UK, the medical people objected to it and said, look, we'll all remember it, and when they come come into the hospital and we'll deal with it. And what actually happened was, the medical side of the army as a result decreased. So when it came to the Falklands War, it had become a disaster area. And the guys who suffered in the Falklands War are still suffering today as a result. But they said, if you give us the money to invest in the medicals, we will do it. And Afghanistan is the area where it has really shone bright on it, really. But they've had to go back and relearn all that information about what bomb damage was. World War II, it was different, it would appear, and the other wars they've been in. But they said, so it's just a very interesting lesson that how things go around and come back again, you know. And but it's part of what you're saying there, that even for ourselves at the time when I was working in the city council, we should have maybe an official historian that's going around recording, because it's in that sense. We do have archives, but it's more what we put into the archives rather than the person in the archives coming to us and demanding.
My name is Seamus Moriarty. I'm not an engineer. I'm interested in history and an interest in history of engineering. One thing I noticed of Michael's talk, all the people he spoke about tonight, they all appear to be very good people underneath it all. no scandal in their backgrounds. None of them appear to make a fortune out of their work. Some of them, in fact, end up in fairly poorish conditions, you know. And it might be an issue for Engineers Ireland to look into, to make sure that the contribution of these people is recognised in the history syllabus, primary, second and third level. Particularly Dargan. That man deserves, you know, such a remarkable figure and such a huge contribution to the development of Ireland in the 19th century, and maybe deserves more recognition than he's getting so far. Thank you.
Kieran Feehan, Engineers Ireland. Congratulations, Michael, great presentation. Just following on Seamus's point here, we had a number of commemorations of Dargan in 2017. It was the 150th anniversary of his death, and Carlow County Council sponsored a full one-day seminar, and I believe the President will get of ICE will get a presentation on Dargan tomorrow in Dunleary Harbour, and I fully accept what you say. I suppose following on that point, Michael, the connection between art and engineering, as you showed at the end there, I'm sure many here realise Dargan was the man who set up the National Gallery, and in the current year, or in 2017, ESB sponsored the complete refurbishment of the Dargan wing, the original wing of the National Gallery. So again, a huge connection between culture and engineering. A question for you, Michael. You showed the development on the east side of the Liffey when the Custom House moved, and then the bridges. I wonder, could you talk about the sequencing of that? Did people want to build bridges, so they moved the Custom House, or did they move the Custom House and then were able to build the bridges because of navigation? Thank you.
Yeah. No, the original Customs House, or the first Customs House actually, was the Clarence Hotel, what we know as the Clarence Hotel. So what effectively that meant was, if you were a sailing boat, because you didn't have power, you had to try and make it up to that area, or close to that area, so that the customs people could get on board. And, you know, the tidal, everything was just a mess. The boats were getting bigger, there was long delays, so Beresford was very much a go-ahead guy, but he also wanted to develop the eastern side of the city, so he did. And he brought in Gandon. He could see themselves extending the quays down along, and because the bigger boats were beginning to come in, he said, right, we will build this customs house down here. Now, it was in a swamp as far as they were concerned, and as history would tell us, there was riots at the time. And he had hoped that a man by the name of Cooley would do it, because Cooley had done the forecourts and he had done the city hall, but Cooley died, and Gandon had to finish off some of Cooley's work, and that's why he brought him in. But that was the main idea. It had nothing to do with building bridges. It was to do with the development of the port. He was a revenue commissioner. He saw money from the taxes, the import duties and all that, and could he just move it that way east, and that. The building of the bridges, then he saw that the Earl of Louth and all these people that owned it, you know, all this land on the north, and then the development around Westmoreland Street and De Vere Street, build a bridge there. He got Gandon to design it, and because he was also on the ballast board, he gave the permission then to actually build it. The thing that happened then was, of course, it was built too narrow, and 80 years later they had to double the width. But the interesting part about that was that they insisted that Butt Bridge would be built first and put a swivel bridge there, so that nobody would be held. And it just showed the citizens' power, really, at the time, that the trams could get through and the swivel built. So the one contractor, I remember by the name of Doherty, built it first of all Butt Bridge, and then widened out O'Connell Bridge. So when the Memorial Bridge, when they were going to put the fixed link, then what happened was the loop line came in then, which meant that the swivel bridge was useless, only 10 years later. So in 1930, when they were going to fix the span on Butt Bridge, take out the opening span, the port insisted that into the legislation that any bridge built further down would be of a navigable bridge. and if possible that it would be a transporter would be built where you actually drive the car, you know, it's a big girder truss cross, and you drive the car onto a cable car and it just drives, it goes across the river. And in theory, that's what we should maybe have built at Mackin Street, so you wouldn't have the Calatrava design. But that was to try and prevent that happening at the time, you know, that the port were getting the idea that the city were trying to grab the harbour for their use. So that's the main reason behind it, though. It was business.
Keith Elliott, ICE, Republic of Ireland branch. Michael, one of our contributors here suggested that some of the great engineers of the past should be on the history syllabus and so on. I would venture to suggest that the life and works of Michael Phillips should also be on the school curriculum. I think that your enthusiasm for engineering, your extraordinary knowledge is absolutely inspirational, and you know, if we could spread you around the schools, we'd end up with a lot more civil engineers than we have now.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for all the various contributions, and I now call on Cormac Bradley, our chairman of the Republic of Ireland branch of the ICE, to conclude matters here.
Ladies and gentlemen, you'd be very pleased to know that I'm the penultimate speaker of the night. My first point of duty is, first of all, to thank the Heritage Society, Con and Rowan particularly, for hosting tonight and allowing us to piggyback the first day of this ICE celebratory visit onto their normal lecture theatre. I'd also like to thank the full-time members of staff within Engineers Ireland who facilitated the setting up of today, the management of the RSVPs in order to allow us to have an appropriate reception afterwards. But my second duty and my important duty is to invite the President of the ICE in its current capacity to please say a few words on behalf of the ICE in his guest capacity. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Robert Mair, President of the ICE.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, can I start by saying what an enormous privilege it is to be here this evening, to hear such a fantastic, wonderful lecture, which was really enthralling, and I learnt so much about the history of engineering in Ireland, but also fascinating to the kind of linkage between English engineering and Irish engineering. Of course, as you will all know, this is our 200th anniversary of the Institution of Civil Engineers, and that's being celebrated in many different ways. So on the 2nd of January in 1818, in a rather, I think, quite seedy coffee house called the Kendal Coffee House off Fleet Street in London, 3 young engineers met, Henry Robinson Palmer, James Jones and Joshua Field, and said, let's form what became the Institution of Civil Engineers. And they searched around. They knew at the outset who should be their president. But they didn't actually persuade Thomas Telford for another 2 years. He actually became the first president, but not until 1820, because they spent the best part of 2 years persuading him to take on the job. When he did take on the job, he remained president until he died. So he was the longest serving president of the Institution of Civil Engineers. And he, incidentally, is a wonderful book. I'm sure, Michael, you're such an expert, you will know about this book. There's a wonderful book recently published just last year called Man of Iron, which is a new biography of Thomas Telford by Julian Glover. It's a wonderful read. And much of what you talked about this evening comes out also, the huge connections he made with so many other engineers. So as you'll know, there was it took a while for, it wasn't until 8 years after Thomas Telford became president that there was then a royal charter granted to the institution. And in fact, that was updated a long time later in 1975 by our Queen. And we now have a global membership of 92,000. And our mission hasn't really changed, I think. It hasn't changed since the days of Telford and those 3 young engineers. It is to harness the great sources and power of nature for the benefit of society. And I think we've heard tonight from Michael the most wonderful array of examples of just that taking place. And I think it was a real tour de force, and I just want to offer a few thoughts about it. I just think it was terrific. I very much liked the way you started with the rebellion in 1798. I'm going to come back to that. You'll see why a little bit later. But in particular, the French Revolution was where you really started your lecture, and then moved on through. And a real theme, which I suppose really rang true for me, was the frequent reference to Thomas Telford. He had. I liked the fact that William Jessup gave Thomas Telford his first job, I think, as you said. And I remember Alex Scampton. I knew him quite well, and he always reckoned that William Jessup was the man he most admired in all of the. Scampton did a great, like Michael, became a great expert on the history of engineering, and he always said that William Jessup was the person he rated the most highly. And it was interesting that Alexander Nemo was somebody also acquainted with Thomas Telford, and I think that was interesting for me. I love the name Bindon Blood Stoney. It's a fantastic name. He had something to do. He was very interesting about marine works and precast construction, floating trains, and diving bells. I'm going to come back to that too. So French Revolution and diving bells are going to be something I was mentioned in a minute. And of course, Benjamin McNeil also worked alongside Thomas Telford. It's just a great string of eminent people, and William Dargan, amazing. And again, I think Thomas Telford had an influence on William Dargan. And I completely agree with the point you made. I think William Dargan should be absolutely heralded in primary schools, secondary schools. You know, what a fantastic way of inspiring young engineers or young potential engineers. That's something that the ICE 200 is very much doing in our whole year of celebration of 1818, is to inspire the younger generation. That's probably the most important thing we're trying to do. So there are, if you're ever in London, please do come to the headquarters of the Institution of Civil Engineers. There's an amazing exhibition on all year, which is primarily aimed at children, but it's great fun for adults too. And it's aimed at children, their parents, their teachers, and it's called Invisible Superheroes. And it's a wonderful. It's really looking forward to the future. Of course, it's great to learn about the William Dargans and what they have done, but our focus has been more about the exciting things that engineers of the future are going to be doing. I mentioned the French Revolution, and I mentioned diving bells for the reason that I want to make a presentation to Michael. And this presentation is a commemorative medallion. It's a reproduction of a medallion that was produced at the time of the completion of the Thames Tunnel in London. And some of you may know this was an absolutely epic project, and it was it has the name of two great engineers, one possibly more well-known than the other. The really well-known one is I.K. Brunel, but he was the 18-year-old son, and his first job was the resident engineer on his father's project, Sir Mark Brunel. And it was an extraordinary story because Mark Brunel was French, and he escaped from France because of the French Revolution, because he was an educated engineer, and that wasn't a good thing to be educated at the time of the French Revolution, because you're likely to get your head chopped off. So he went to New York, and just before he left France to go to New York, he had met an English woman who was very adventurous for the times. She was in France to learn French, and her name was Sophia Kingdom. And he met her, liked her, and then left France and went to New York, and he became chief engineer for New York at the age of 26 and did some amazing projects. And about 4 years later, he left New York and he came to London, and he looked for and found Sophia Kingdom, and they got married. And their son was Mark Brunel's real full name was Isambard Mark Brunel. Actually, it was Mark Isambard Brunel. So their son was christened Isambard Kingdom Brunel. However, back to the Thames Tunnel. The Thames Tunnel was the first tunnel in the world under a river. And it was a horrendously difficult project. It started in 1825 and it was finished in 1843. 18 years to go 300 metres from one side of the River Thames to the other. It was catastrophic. The tunnel collapsed about 5 times, the people lost their lives, the company went bust several times, but behind it all was a brilliant, brilliant invention by Mark Brunel, which was the tunnelling shield, and which was a device really, it was a cast iron device. It was actually rectangular in shape, but essentially it enabled the miners to work under some protection to stop the ground from falling in on their heads, and with a very clever way of erecting the brick lining behind the shield, and they then jacked this shield forward from the completed brick lining. This invention is the forerunner of modern-day tunnelling machines, and it was an extraordinary project. At the end, when it was finally finished, and when Queen Victoria and Prince Albert came to open it, Mark Brunel struck a commemorative medallion, and we've had that reproduced to celebrate this 200th anniversary of the Institution of Civil Engineers. And so it has on the front side, it has a picture of the tunnel, and it has some writing. It says, Thames Tunnel, 1,200 feet long, commenced 1824, completed 1842, 76 feet below high water, cost £450,000. Sir I.M. Brunel, engineer. And on the back is a portrait of Sir Mark. And so it gives me really huge pleasure to present this medallion to you, Michael, for your outstanding lecture.
Thank you, Mr. President. The ICE Republic of Ireland branch have a very small token in comparison with that, but we do have a piece of engineering that was featured in Michael's presentation. However, there's no heritage value to it whatsoever. In fact, it's a blown-up photograph that was taken last week. So, as I say, it pales into insignificance, but it is, ladies and gentlemen, a reasonable rendition of the Dunleary Harbour as we recognise it today. So, Michael, it's a miserly token of appreciation. So thank you very much for your time. And ladies and gentlemen, all that I have left to do is to thank you for your patience and for your time this evening, and to invite you to join us all for a reception in Café Clyde. Thank you very much for your time this evening.